Hello readers, I'm the avid reader and today we're reviewing Economic Facts and Fallacies, written by Thomas Sowell in 2007. So this could be viewed as a sequel in a sense to Basic Economics, except that you can see here that Basic Economics is much larger than Economic Facts and Fallacies. So Economic Facts and Fallacies, that's about 240 pages in medium-sized letters. So it's a pretty quick read. You can read it in 10 hours. There are 8 chapters and it looks at different fallacies that people believe in. So it looks at the fallacies and then it looks at the real facts. So he argues that these fallacies, different fallacies that people believe in, are based on 5 central fallacies. First one is the zero-sum fallacy, which believes that if someone gains, then someone loses. The second one is the composition fallacy, which states that if something is true in one place, then it is true everywhere. Or it means also, if it is good for me, then it must be good for everyone. So this is very good for bureaucrats. So they get a job by doing some policy. That's actually bad, but then they can believe in the composition fallacy. The third fallacy is the post hoc fallacy, which believes if B happened after A, then A led to B. They believe that there is correlation with this, but correlation is not causation. So the fourth fallacy is the chess pieces fallacy, which ignores that people are individuals and when you pass laws against them, they react to turn them into their favor. And the fifth is, and final fallacy is the open-ended fallacy, which ignores that resources are limited and scarce. So there are 6 chapters which analyze different issues. So the first one is on urban facts and fallacies. So he talks about transportation and how you have population concentration in cities, and cities exist because the costs of production are lowered when they are mass produced and there are more people to serve to. So if you live in the cities, it's easier to find the service you need. However, there are some side effects to this, like there's often more crime in such an area and not everyone knows who. The automobile has facilitated the lives of many people and have made it easier for them to find more and more jobs. And these social planners, they try to limit automobiles by they wanting people to use public transportation, but automobiles are much more efficient than public transportation, as an automobile takes you where you want. While to public transportation, you must make stops at your bus and they take another bus and it's more inefficient. So a great theme in this book is what government planners don't understand is their policies are inefficient, and that's an example. Public transportation is not as efficient for the individual as a personal car. Then he talks about housing prices and how the government have in effect increased housing prices by limiting supply. So if you're not allowed to build a 20-story apartment complex, then you're limiting the supply and you have to expand the number of houses that have to be built, and it's inefficient. So some people don't like urban sprawl, that, oh look, all this architecture, I don't like how it looks, I want to change that, and they're looking up from their plane. But in fact, if people didn't like such houses, they would just take their businesses and leave and go to something else. Another lesson is if the market does something, that's showing the choices of the people, and third parties shouldn't control that. And of course, politicians and bureaucrats and courts, they disregard private property rights. They believe that they can ransack places. They declare a place a slum and then they raise it to the ground. And this in fact hurt poor people because now they have to move, and this is bad for businesses as the loyal customer base they have cultivated locally, while now it's gone. They have to go somewhere else. When they ban cars for people to go to malls, these malls are inefficient and go out of business. Then the third chapter is about male to female facts and fallacies. So he brings up actually that historically, and these are trends that are contrary to popular beliefs, but women had more occupation in education and in other professions during the early 20th century than the mid 20th century. So there was a decline between the 30s until the 50s of women in work and things like that. And then that picked up back in the 50s again. So trends are not always as they seem. People talk about why are women and men not paid as much? Well, that is because there are occupational differences. For example, so men take jobs that are less well paid, men take jobs that are better paid, where you have a higher probability of dying. That's an opportunity cost. Also, men tend to work more full-time, or they work these unreliable hours. They're more ready to work 60 hours a week, while a woman isn't necessarily ready to do that, and often they work part-time. And there's a thing where if you take a pause in your career, then that hurts your income long-term, and women, when they have children, they take out time to take care of their children, while men, they continue working. So there are opposite trends, in fact, between men and women. Women earn better than men often when they're younger, but as they grow older and they get children, men earn much more than women. But if you compare full-time working men and full-time working women, and both never took breaks, then they earn about the same. So if you don't compare apples and oranges, if you don't compare someone who works full-time or over 60 hours with someone who works 30, then you will see that the wage gap decreases a lot. So a lot of uncomparable things, and when you have controlled the statistics for different fields, you discover, okay, the unexplainable percentage is only a few for the income of a man earning more than a woman, and sometimes the woman earns more than a man when all factors are accounted for. The fourth part is academic facts and fallacies. So here's the thing, universities, they tend to think more about the faculty than the students. The faculty has a lot of power, so they decide the time of the day, so they come into work after rush hour, and so they can play tennis and things like that. But this makes it so that more classes are used at certain times and then they're not filled at other times. So more class space is needed, more space is needed. So it makes college more expensive. And then the accrediting criteria by the American Bar Association, for example, for seeing if a college is correct or not, it's not seeing if you pass the bar exam, it's, oh, how many books do you have, or how much do you spend? So you get higher points as a university if you spend a lot of money instead of being efficient. So the private university, University of Phoenix, for example, is a much more efficient system for students than public universities. Students don't pay actually for most of the tuition often, a lot of students like that. So government spends a bunch, they get a bunch of revenue from athletics, even if it's an inefficient system. He explains that in more detail. Professors, they have a tendency to get tenure, and how they evaluate different statistics are not correct. So a lot of professors focus on research to get more income. They are well paid. So it requires the hiring of more teachers, and they're full-time, but they're not teaching that much. He gives a lot of personal anecdotes, Thomas Sowell. So for example, he mentions he worked 12 years at a university but only teach there 5 years. So it puts things a bit in perspective. And the value added of colleges, comparing a college graduate with a high school graduate who didn't graduate high school, it's not comparable often, and they don't have all the data. They don't include all the factors that are necessary to compare things. They don't take all variables into account. That's a big problem with these statistics in general when comparing things. And the admission process, it's not based on merit, it's a bit random, and there's quotas, and blacks and Hispanics, they get extra points, they have easier to come into university, and then Asians are discriminated against a lot. So you can get a perfect score as an Asian, and you're not guaranteed to come into university. So Sowell argues it would be much more efficient if you just based it on merit and the grades you got when you got into university, and not whether, okay, which race you are, what are the quotas and things like that. And the evaluation of education in general is basically, okay, how much do you spend on education, instead of, okay, how well do the students succeed who exit university? What kind of jobs do they do? Which income bracket are they in? So the statistics measure often input instead of output, which is a mistake. The fifth chapter discusses income, facts and fallacies. So Thomas Sowell discusses that the stagnation of wages is a myth, as although household wages have grown not that much, that's because people used to live in households many more. So you maybe had half a dozen before, and now you've got a couple people, so that's a big change. So real income for individuals has actually gone up for pretty much everyone. And then when measuring income inequality, and you compare between the rich and the poor, it's actually not the have and the have-nots, it's the have and the have-lots. Because when you talk about the growing income inequality between the top 20% and the bottom 20%, not taking into account that a lot of those in the bottom 20% have now gone to higher income brackets. And here's a fact. They talk about the top 1% or the top 0.1%, but almost nobody remains for a long time in the 0.1%, and not that many remain for a long time in the 1%. And people who are in the top 20% don't earn that much. There's exaggeration and things like that. People who are in income brackets generally don't stay there. People move up and down. There's a lot of social mobility, at least in the United States. It's a myth that there's a vanishing middle class since incomes have really gone up, so you've had a shift to the right. So just because it looks like the middle class has shrunk, Sowell states just because it looks statistically that there's less people in the middle class, well, that's because there are more people in classes above the middle class. So there are more people who are now over 100,000 than 50 to 75,000. People have gone from being middle class to upper class instead of going from middle class to poor class. So a lot of these insinuations about statistics are false, actually, if you look at them, actually. Real income per capita is a very important figure to look at. You're discussing how the bottom 20% or the old are poor because they barely get any income. Well, you don't account for pensions, you don't account for government services that they get, you don't account for charity, you don't account for savings they had previously. So people often look poorer than they actually are. And by the way, most poor people, they have a microwave, they have air conditioning, they have these comfortable lifestyles. They're just a little less comfortable than ours. So being poor in America is not that bad. The 6th chapter discusses racial facts and fallacies. It talks about group differences, and you cannot expect people to be equal, have an equal outcome of things, as people have different culture. Oh yeah, people who are older earn more than people who are younger. So for example, blacks are younger than whites, so that's one of the factors that makes whites earning more than blacks. And it's a myth that as time goes on, discrimination decreases, as Jews were appreciated during the 15th century in the Ottoman Empire, but in the final decades of the Ottoman Empire they were hated. So sometimes trends aren't necessarily good, and blacks had it better in the late 1800s than in the early 1900s, for example, as more blacks moved into the north. Then the blacks who were assimilated to the north were also discriminated against. Poverty decreased for blacks very fast in the 2 decades before the Civil Rights Acts and affirmative action, and the decrease in poverty slowed down after this government intervention in race relations and things like that. So there was barely any change in the 1970s and 1980s compared to the 1940s and 1950s in black poverty. And violence and poverty was not because of slavery. You can see that the violence erupted in the 1960s in the cities that were most open for blacks. There was barely any riots in the South. And tough on crime measures, for example, a shoot to kill order in Chicago prevented riots there. And then he talks about also there's discrimination. While sometimes employment discrimination makes sense, when you don't have a lot of information gathered on your applicee and getting information is expensive, then it makes sense sometimes to discriminate based on race. As for example, you hire an Asian and you know that statistically he's going to be much safer, much better worker than if you hire someone who's black. As there are more criminals as blacks, so the bad apples in one race negatively affects all of them. And of course, when you have high crime in a ghetto, that's what makes products so expensive in the neighborhood. So it's not greed, as politicians like to claim. And lending rates, denied lending to blacks. Well, blacks have a not as good credit score as other races. And here's the thing, when you're talking about discrimination against blacks, remember, whites are not at the top of getting accepted in different things and these advantages. Asians are. So you would be claiming that, okay, whites are not discriminating against blacks also. They are also discriminating against whites in favor of Asians. So if you follow those arguments to their logical conclusion, they don't make any sense. And then the penultimate chapter is on third world facts and fallacies. And it talks about how geography can help the development of a country a lot. But it isn't guaranteed, and the things that are important are good rivers or lakes where you can trade easily, and then having, for example, livestock, so horses. Having horses in Europe help development a lot. Then there are some disadvantages. So the reason there's differences between Europe and Asia is because you've got a bunch of deserts and mountains blocking them, so that's why there are 2 different continents. And then Sub-Saharan Africa was so undeveloped because of the Sahara Desert that's as big as the United States. And you have to keep into mind when you're talking about the richest nations and the poorest nations, and you're talking about the ratio has increased between how rich a country is compared to a poor one, while the poor countries, about half of them, or a large portion of them, are no longer poor. So Singapore used to be poor, now they're rich. Argentina used to be richer than a lot of European nations, now they're not that wealthy anymore. And having natural resources isn't necessarily that useful. Nigeria has a lot of oil, but that doesn't really work that well for them. They are pretty corrupt, so they are poor. Saudi Arabia, they have their oil, but they're not as rich as Japan, for example, which has no natural resources. So it is the culture and the belief in exploitation that people trade and they exploit one another, and foreign investment, while that discourages investment in your country, and now your country is poor because no one wants to invest in it. There's no formal markets, there's no rule of law, which is very important. You have to have a law and order society. That's why Africa is poor, for example. No correlation between population density and wealth, and foreign aid never really works. You cannot compare the Marshall Plan with Africa, as the Marshall Plan already had a culture ready for it that was developed, and you already had the knowledge required. While you can send resources, but what is more important for Africa is that they get knowledge and people with skills. So skills and knowledge are more important than resources. And you need to look at which type of societies developed out of poverty. You don't look at, okay, what is the cause of poverty? No, you look at what created wealth. So for example, when Japan got kicked in the teeth by the Americans in the mid-19th century, while they realized that they had to develop fast, so they had a culture to better themselves, while in Zimbabwe they blame the whites on their problems and they seize their wealth. Well, that creates poverty long term, and they have food issues and things like that. So focusing on how you can better your country instead of blaming all the others is very important for third world countries. Those are a bunch of the facts and fallacies he brings up. There are a lot of them, but yeah, the general message is, look out for these 5 fallacies, and when you judge something, look at the output instead of the input. And when you see a statistic, look if you're measuring the same thing as you did before. So how would I rate economic facts and fallacies? I would give it a 9 out of 10. So I would recommend that you read basic economics if you have the time before you read economic facts and fallacies. Economic facts and fallacies is a good sequel which shows why intervention and a bunch of surrounding myths which would discredit capitalism are wrong, which is great. So Thomas Sowell, good job with this. Everything he touches is gold, this author. He's a great economist, I'd say. You consider the facts and you don't really view yourself as this esoteric third-party view where you think you can move around people and you make assumptions that if there's a difference between two groups, then that means that one is exploiting the other. No. So, yeah, great book. Highly recommend it. Economic Facts and Fallacies, 9 out of 10. Great job, Dr. Thomas Sowell. So, readers, this was the Avid Reader's review of Economic Facts and Fallacies written by Thomas Sowell in 2007. It got a 9 out of 10. I hope you readers enjoyed this book review, and I will see you readers next time.